Green had also carried out what he claimed were scientific experiments to determine the age at which boys were first capable of orgasms. For the experiment, he masturbated 317 infants and children from 2 months to 15 years old, recording which ones achieved what he interpreted as orgasms. Kinsey reproduced this as Table 31. In Table 32, he laid out the time it had taken Green to bring each of these children to these so-called orgasms. Green also claimed that his experiments proved that, given sufficient adult stimulation, some of the boys were capable of multiple orgasms. Again, with no way of checking the claims, Kinsey simply reproduced them as scientific fact. Finally, in Table 34, Kinsey set out Green's notes on the time it had taken him to masturbate the children to multiple orgasms.
The average interval between the first and second climaxes ranged from less than 10 seconds to 30 minutes or more. Even the youngest males, as young as 5 months in age, are capable of such repeated reactions.
The table suggested that some children, including a 4-year-old boy, had been masturbated over a 24-hour period. In his book, and based primarily on Green's information, Kinsey claimed that children could, with the assistance of an experienced adult, enjoy sexual activity from the moment they were born. It was a revolutionary claim that overturned all previous scientific knowledge about the development of child sexuality. But the claim and the experiments that lay behind it have alarmed Kinsey's critics, particularly those who campaign for a return to traditional values.
We have a whole chapter here in which children have been tortured for this so-called scientific data. And this is the calculations of those abuse data into tables to promote this as scientific to the world. An assessment of these data suggests that at minimum 317, at maximum 1,200 and some boys were being sexually raped around the clock using stopwatches.
Because of its illegal origins, Green's material was a closely guarded secret. Only a trusted inner circle knew of its existence.
It was illegal, and we knew it was illegal, but it's very important for people to study childhood sexuality. In other cultures, anthropologists can sometimes do this, but in our culture, it was because of our insistence that children are non-sexual, studying childhood sexuality was essentially impossible, except, for this case like Green. And so he contributed a fair amount to our knowledge of, and when I say our knowledge, I mean medicine's knowledge of sexuality in children. Yeah.
But some of Kinsey's team questioned both the morality and the scientific validity of using the material.
Well, when I saw the table on time to orgasm, when infants are stimulated, carried out to the fraction of a second, I thought it was an absurd page in science. But to actually stand there with a stopwatch and have somebody or oneself stimulate the infant and time it to the split second was simply so gross that I didn't feel it had a place in a scientific book.
Remember that Noah, who I've never met, was he's a very upstanding kind of man. He was damaged in childhood with all this morality. And then he had this peculiar moralistic wife, I'm understating it, and through all this, it sounded to him like pure sin.
Whether or not I had a moral objection to it, and I did, but that was not the point. It was that this was a scientific book. He was proud of its being scientific. And here was some completely unevaluated, potentially important stuff carried out to absurd numbers, fractions of a second. It was irrelevant. It was unworthy of him as a scientist.
50 years after Kinsey first published Green's paedophile diaries as scientific fact, the Kinsey Institute has been forced to defend his involvement with paedophiles. Director John Bancroft accepts that the scientific reliability of Green's diaries was dubious, but believes Kinsey was justified to make use of them.
Kinsey made it clear in his writings that he saw his task as finding out as much information about sexual behavior as he could. And he sought information from wherever he could find it. He also made it very clear that he did not see it as his role as a scientist to make moral judgments.
I think that Alfred Kinsey used this individual's data and shaped a chapter drawing upon it, really disgraced his discussion and elevated to the realm of scientific information, what should have been dismissed as unreliable, self-serving data provided by a predatory pedophile.
How did Alfred Kinsey, a respected scientist and devoted father, become so involved with a man like Green? The answer may lie in a personal war he was fighting, a war against all moral and legal restrictions on sex, a war that had its roots in his own childhood in the slums of Hoboken, New York.
His parents were very poor, and Kinsey's life was dominated to begin with by poverty, very religious, repressive, not just sexually in every way, drink, smoking, Methodist religious background. The family was almost friendless. They were so religious. There are examples of him praying to be allowed to stop masturbating. He remained religious until into his 20s. He then lost his religion, and he turned with fury on religion. He thought it was hypocritical. The repression, the frustration, sexual frustration he experienced as a result of his father's strictures, that anger remained with him all his life.
Kinsey's close colleagues believed that this anger fueled his research. To carry out the research, Kinsey believed his key staff needed personal experience of a wide variety of sexual behavior. To ensure this, he encouraged them to have sex with each other.
One night, Kinsey said, "Why don't you come down to my room?" So I went down, and I immediately felt some tension in the air, which was quite different from anything I had experienced with him before. And it suddenly occurred to me that Kinsey was preparing to offer me the opportunity to have some homosexual experience. And I said, "I don't think I want to participate in this, and please excuse me," and I walked out the door.
But Kinsey's interest was not solely scientific. He had discovered that he was increasingly sexually attracted to men and had begun to live a double life. In public, he appeared to be a happily married, respectable academic. In private, he sought out homosexual encounters. But these were illegal, and he was forced to keep them secret.
On the one hand, he had a wife, he had children, he had a career as a respected college professor. On the other hand, he had sexual needs and desires that could not be met within the confines of middle-class morality. That made him, of necessity, cultivate two kind of parallel existences. The one the world saw, the one that was private, sovereign, and known only to himself. So when he builds a staff in which there is some wife swapping, when he builds a staff in which there are some gay contacts, he's doing it, I think, out of needs that are both professional and private.
To satisfy these twin motives, Kinsey secretly commissioned a series of explicit sex films involving his staff and outside volunteers. Clarence Tripp was his first photographer and became one of his closest confidants.
I was a photographer from 20th Century Fox, and he said, "Oh," among other things, do make me some movies. I need 2,000 orgasms. Of course, we never got to 2,000, but we got to hundreds.
The types of behavior filmed kind of run the gamut. There was a lot of just, heterosexual copulation. There was masturbation. There was also more than a little masochism filmed at the Institute. Kinsey, I think, wanted to use these films to, to study and to learn and to observe. That motivation was certainly there. I think also Kinsey has a personal interest in seeing the filming take place. For him, it's both satisfying emotionally, and it's also important scientifically that the filming take place.
But Kinsey had begun to realize this type of sex research would take a heavy toll on both him and his staff.
When Kinsey first hired me to do pictures, he said, I want to warn you of something. As soon as we get you to photographing sex every day and paying attention to sex, right, left, and center, pretty soon nothing will turn you on. Nothing in the area, nothing visual will turn you on, because you'll lose all those sensitivities.
As he immersed himself ever deeper in human sexuality, the effects on Kinsey were becoming difficult to hide. Torn between the demands of his public image and his private sexual needs, his behavior became increasingly self-destructive.
A strong association developed in him that in order to have sexual pleasure, he also had to pay for it in pain. Kinsey, on one occasion, circumcised himself with a pocket knife without anesthesia or anything else. That, to me, is an act of a desperate man. It's an act of a person whose private boundaries are starting to erode.
In 1947, Kinsey sent the final proofs of his chapter on child sexuality for approval by the paedophile he codenamed Mr. Green. Much of it came from Green's child abuse diaries, which has called into question its value.
The fact that it's only one person in itself weakens its scientific value, but doesn't remove it. We've known of a few people of this kind who have kept detailed recordings of their sexual exploits over a long period of time. To some extent, they may feel that they're justifying their sexual behavior in the process of documenting it. And I think one has to be rather cautious about accepting their information just at face value.
Kinsey's critics say that whether or not the material was scientific, he should have reported Green to the police. But the Kinsey Institute rejects this.
It's inconceivable that one could do research in that way, give people guarantees of confidentiality, and then when they've given you the information say, well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to report you to the police. That would be immorality in my book of the highest order.
Some of Kinsey's other defenders claim that Green had long ceased to be an active child abuser by the time he met Kinsey, and so there was no need to report him to the police. But the Kinsey Institute refuses to release Green's diaries, which could corroborate this. Only trusted Kinsey supporters are allowed access to them.
By convincing them that I was not against Kinsey, but concerned to find out what he was really like, and as they got used to me and realized that I was honest and sincere, I did finally get into, I think, everything I could reasonably have expected.
But Jonathan Gaythorne Hardy's notes, taken during his access to Green's diaries, suggest that the paedophile was sexually active until 1954, more than 10 years after he first met Kinsey.
What does the highlighted piece mean?
Yes. Well, you see, he may have done, but the thing is, Kinsey didn't use that information. It's quite possible that Green went on, in fact, I'm sure he did, went on having sex with everybody until then. But that was long after Kinsey had got the journals.